question, how should I read my Bible? That's the main question we're answering. And we're doing that by answering the question, what is the Bible about? If somebody walked into an elevator and they said, what is the Bible about? And you have just 30 seconds to tell them before they get off the elevator, what would you say? That's the question we're trying to answer during all this. So to start it out, let's go ahead and split up into groups. Based upon what we read last week, we were all studying various passages, various themes throughout the Scriptures. If you didn't have a theme that you were studying, it's fine. You can just join someone else's group. And it'll be great. So, did everyone bring their papers or no? If not, it's fine. Just like what you guys studied, just like talk about it together. So I think we had the theme of like God's speech. So if you had the theme of God's speech, then just come up to this corner. If you had the theme of judgment versus mercy, just come up to this corner. If you had the theme of blessing versus cursing, then go to the back corner. The theme of, what else did we have? The theme of the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent. That back corner. Okay, let's go ahead and come back for a second. I want to spend 2 minutes with everyone. Everyone find somebody who is not in your group and explain to them one thing that your group discussed. So get up, let's do it. Okay, great, let's go ahead and come back here. And if we could just have a couple people give one thing they learned, quick summary version. Is there anyone from Blessing or God's speech that wants to share to us real quick something they learned? Someone who studied God's speech. When God speaks, it happens. Genesis 1, God says, let there be light, and there was light. Anyone from blessing versus cursing? Yeah, it kind of was like that group over there. Anything?
Mentioned 5 times.
Okay. The word curse is mentioned 5 times in Genesis 1 through 11, which is going to be very important. There's blessing in the garden. There's curse of the ground. There's deliverance from the curse with Noah, or at least there's a prophecy of it. Anyone else want to? What other groups? What else were people discussing? Anyone else want to share something? Did anyone do mercy versus judgment? which is similar to blessing versus cursing. Okay, it's really interesting. Mercy versus judgment. How does God respond to certain situations? God pronounces judgment in Genesis 3, but he also pronounces mercy. Same thing with Cain. He gives judgment, but he says, but I'm going to give a mark on your head. Mercy. With Noah, he says, I'm going to destroy the world, but yet he says, I'm going to save Noah. Mercy. Then we get to, in just a second, don't want to give anything away. Let's do some quick review real quick. We're talking mostly about relationships. There were 3 perfect relationships in the garden that we talked about. Man and God, man and woman, man and creation. The serpent came in to God's order, which was like this. It was structured like this. And the serpent said, I'm going to take God out of the picture, and I'm going to have creation rule over woman, over man, reversing the image of God. We talked about a addition problem. What does relationships look like in the Bible? Does anyone remember these? I actually changed the first one. But does anyone remember the second 2? It's fine if you don't. I mentioned it really in passing. Law is the second one. Law is blue. Okay, my PowerPoints, law was always blue. So, if that helps you. What was the faith? Okay, was the last one. Whenever we have a relationship with the Bible, it's always associated with promise, law, and faith. Every time. Every single time. There is never an instance in the Bible where one of them is not given, and God gives all 3 of them to those who he wishes to call his people. We talked about this promise of restoration that was coming. I was running out of time, so I did a bad job explaining how these 2 are connected. What is the promise here? In Genesis 3:15. Yeah, there is going to be a descendant of the woman who will crush the serpent. The serpent destroys relationships, so if somebody comes who can crush the serpent, maybe those relationships will be brought back together. Why is there tension in the Noah story? If we're looking for a seed of the woman who's going to crush the head of the serpent, and God says, I'm going to kill everyone, why is there tension there? Yeah, it's like, oh, you're going to kill everyone. But God rescues Noah, and he says to Noah, I'm going to reestablish my covenant with you. And what's going to happen is, I'm going to promise you I'm never going to wipe out everyone again. So I would like to explain the relationship between these two like this. The Noahic covenant protects this promise. God will bring it to pass. Nothing will stop it. We talked about the theme of law. How did these two laws, the law given to Adam and the law given to Noah, relate? Does anyone remember what we said? What was the law given to Adam? Yeah, don't eat of this tree. Don't do it. What was the law given to Noah? What? Build the ark. Yeah, okay. We're talking about, that's very true. Okay, so in Genesis 9, here God says to Adam, don't eat of the tree and be fruitful, multiply. Here God says to Noah, he says, be fruitful, multiply, rule over the earth, like he said to Adam. But he said, also don't kill people, because that's bad. And if anyone kills anyone, you kill them. Like you have the right to do that. So we said they're related like this. This is the law given to Adam and the law given to Noah expands that. Now what's interesting about the fact that Cain murdered Abel prior to the story of Noah? When is the law don't murder revealed? After. But God still holds him accountable for it. So we could say, before this law is revealed, God still doesn't want people to murder people. Like, that is always wrong. So we're almost looking for, what else? What other moral standards does God have? There's a tension there. We're pushed forward. We talked about, we're in the part of the story with the rising action. It was creation, but then we had the inciting moment that ruined everything, and now everything in the rising action, this part of the story is pointing towards the climax. Everything pushes us that way. Now, we talked about a couple of misconceptions. The first one we're going to address right now. There are a bunch of these random stories that have nothing to do with each other. Before we start in Genesis 12, let's talk about how Genesis 12 relates to Genesis 11. We have a few genealogies. Okay? What was the promise given to Shem at the end of Genesis 9? Does anyone remember? God said to Noah, or Noah said to Shem, he said, God will dwell in your tents. God will live with you. So we're thinking this seed of the woman is going to come through Shem. And this genealogy that's in the next chapter is actually going to take us from Shem to a guy named Abraham. Also, we talked about judgment and mercy. In Genesis 11, we see the Tower of Babel. The only thing that humans can relate to each other and unite upon is rebellion against God. Things are still bad. Okay? God pronounces judgment upon them. They scatter out because they all are broken into different languages. Judgment, no mercy. And then we get to Genesis 12. These are not random stories. They are very much related. In Genesis 12, or let's start in Genesis 11. This genealogy leads us down to a man named Abram and his wife Sarai. And it says, now Sarai was barren and she had no children. Why should this surprise us? We're looking for someone who's going to crush the serpent, and the narrative brings us down to a couple who can't have kids. A woman who's 70 years old. And we need a seed of the woman who can crush the serpent. I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. But at the same time, why should this not surprise us? What do we know about God? Can anyone think of an example that we've already seen that would make us think there's no reason this should surprise us. God loves to work through unusual circumstances and people. God's salvific plans often seem counterintuitive to ensure that he receives maximum glory. We've already seen this with the ark. So, we get to Abram. Genesis 12, 1 through 4. Let's read it. The Lord said to Abram, God speaks. What happens when God speaks? Things happen. Go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house. God asked Abram to leave everything. His country, his family, and his father's house. His land, his family, and his source of blessing. He says, leave it. And he says, go to a land that I'm going to show you. And he says, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. How many times is the word blessing repeated in Genesis 12, 1 through 3? The idea of blessing. 5 times. How many times is cursing mentioned in 1 through 11? 5 times. God is reversing this with Abram. This is a new creation. This is exciting. When God asks people to give up everything to follow him, he gives them abundantly more in return. God says, leave everything, Abram, and follow me. And Abram went. That's how verse 4 starts. The thing with Abram that we're going to learn, when God says do something, he does it every single time, immediately. Often it says the very same day. Okay, so these 3 promises, land, offspring, and blessing, are very important for Genesis. And actually for the rest of the Bible. These promises are going to drive the rest of the Bible. They really will. So, let's first talk about how are these promises threatened. In Genesis 12, 10 through 21, these promises are 10 through 20, these promises are threatened. Let's split up into 3 groups and talk about these texts. And so let's have a group here, and then a group here, and a group back there-ish. So let's talk about how these 3 promises threaten. The group up here talk about land. In the back talk about offspring. And or like God's going to make him a great nation. The group up here talk about blessing. How is blessing threatened? Okay, backstory to this. There's a famine with Abram. And how does Abram respond? So let's go ahead and study this text and figure that out. Let's go ahead and come back together real quick and talk about what we learned. So, how is the theme of land threatened? Group about land. How is the promise of land threatened?
He abandoned it.
Yeah, God's like, go to this land, and Abram goes to Egypt. Okay, how is the theme of offspring threatened? Yeah, okay, so Abram's like, okay, my wife Sarah, you're 70 years old and you're absolutely gorgeous, so they're going to want you. And it's like, okay, I don't know what's going on. Maybe Abram was like delusion, I don't know. No, she was probably really pretty because we're going to find out later. But he says, okay, Sarah, then you just pretend my sister. And Pharaoh's like, well, I'm going to marry her because she's pretty. So Pharaoh-Sarah relationship threatens that. And then blessing, how's the promise of blessing threatened? Yeah, like God's like, I'm going to send plagues on Egypt in order to get you out of there, which is interesting because that's how God delivers his people out of Egypt, with plagues. But anyway, from this we learn that no man can stop God's from accomplishing his salvific plan. God gets Abram and Sarah out of Egypt. It's like, get back to this land. We read normal books looking for these tension points. We should read the Bible like that. These promises are being threatened. So now let's ask the question, how are these 3 promises developed in these texts? So same groups, just take these texts and see what's going on. See how these 3 promises are developed through this narrative. So if you're land before, take land, offspring before, take offspring, blessing before, take blessing. Talk about this. theme of land, how does this progress? Like, if we're reading any other book or watching any other movie and somebody says, okay, you're going to get this land, then you're going to be expecting to, like, figure out something about this. Like, if it's never mentioned again, you're like, oh, that was weird. Maybe it was bad writing. But actually, all three of these promises are further developed. So, theme of land, like, what happens with this? Yeah. God continues to say, I'm going to give you more and more as it progresses. Offspring, how is that promise developed?
He's going to just give his servant, he's going to be like his heir.
Okay, yeah. This is a really good question, because Abram's like, my wife's barren, so are we going to have kids or what? So Abram's like, well, Eliezer, my servant, he'll be the kid. And God's like, no, it's going to come from you. So then what happens?
And then, he just doesn't have any kids, and he's like, oh, still no kids. And he's like, oh, look at all, your kids are going to be like the dust. There's going to be so many of them. And then, later, it's the same thing. He's almost 100, and then he tells them, oh, it's going to be like the stars. There's going to be so many.
You're going to have a lot of kids, and kings is really important. And God says, kings are going to come from you. And then blessing. How is this theme developed? Yeah. Is this random guy named Melchizedek who just is like in and out? Yeah, king of Salem. So.
And then Abraham's a blessing. God promises that he'll bless the people. He's going to bring them down to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to be there for 430 years.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to bring them a blessing.
Yep.
And Abram's also a blessing, right?
Yes, okay, so God comes to Abram and he says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And because we know, we've already read this, who's in Sodom? Lot is in Sodom. Okay, this is Abram's nephew, is Lot, is in Sodom. And so God's like, I'm going to destroy Sodom. And Abram says to God, like they're standing looking over Sodom. Okay, and God is with Abram. And Abram says to God, God, what if there's 50 righteous people in there? Will you kill it? And God's like, for 50 righteous people, I wouldn't kill it. And Abram's like, what about 40? And God's like, for 40, I wouldn't destroy it. What about 30? Well, for 30, I wouldn't destroy it. 20? For 20, I wouldn't destroy it. What about 10 righteous people? Will you not destroy it? Abram is like bartering with God. He's being a blessing to the nations, which is what God promised. What else? How else is blessing developed? Any other ideas, or do you think we got it pretty good? I don't know. We probably covered it pretty well. So land, offspring, and blessing are three promises that are really developed. Let's talk about how they're threatened. I'll just do a quick summary of these. In chapter 13, land is threatened because there's a conflict between Lot and Abram. And there's these herdsmen, and they're like gathering here, and Abram's just like, okay, fine. You know what, Lot? There's so much conflict between our men, and God's like blessing us so much that you just decide wherever you want to go, okay? And that'll be your land. Should Abram have done that or no? It doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us. But Lot chooses the land that's like Eden, called Sodom. Offspring, in Genesis 16, Abram is like 90 years old, and he's like, I don't have any kids. And so Sarah is just like, actually, let's go to Genesis 16 because this is so interesting. There's an Egyptian slave that they have. Where did they get the Egyptian slave? From Egypt. That's a good answer. Okay, he gets it from Egypt because Pharaoh actually sent them off with like blessings and like stuff. And so Hagar is probably from Genesis 12 in Egypt. It doesn't say that, but where else is he going to get an Egyptian slave? From Egypt. Yeah. Okay, so they have this weird custom back then, and so Sarah's just like, okay, you know what? I have this handmaiden named Hagar, so you just like make a kid with her, and we'll call it mine. But let's look at how this is described. Look at verse 3. It says, so Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, the Egyptian slave, and gave to her husband. And Abram listens to the voice of his wife. Where have we heard this language before? Took and gave he listened to the voice of his wife. Adam and Eve. Moses is bringing us back, or the writer of this is bringing us back to understanding this is very much.
That's the point. We're not supposed to listen to our wife.
If she hands you a fruit, or if she says, "Here's an Egyptian woman," don't do it. Okay. Blessing is threatened because God says you're going to be a blessing to the nations. But with Hagar, she has a kid named Ishmael, and then Sarah is just like, "Oh, I wish you didn't have a kid named Ishmael," and Hagar is making fun of her because it's like, "You can't have kids, ha ha ha," and Sarah's just like, "Well, I'm going to treat you harshly," and they're not being a blessing to the nations. There's 3 main chapters that these promises are developed in. Chapter 12, chapter 15, and chapter 17. These are the 3 important passages of the Abrahamic covenant. Chapters 12, 1 through 3. What does green represent? You guys would make me so happy if you know this. Promise. Green is promise. In chapter 12, we have promise of land, seed, and offspring. In chapter 15, again, it's repeated. Only in chapter 15, God enters into a covenant with Abram. Covenant has to do with relationships. This covenant theme is really big. If you want a really good book on covenants, this book is massive. If you read the last 2 chapters, though, you'll get it. Kingdom Through Covenant. I actually just finished that book over break. It took me like a year to read it. But if you read the last 2 chapters, if you want to borrow it, feel free to. If you want to understand covenants in the Bible. In verse 12, it says, chapter 15, as the sun was setting, a deep sleep fell on Abram. When's the last time we saw deep sleep? In the garden with Adam. He put Adam into a deep sleep, and then Eve came. Okay, and then there's this really weird cultural thing that we don't understand, but all these animals are chopped in half, and they're all going to walk between, they're both, God and Abram are going to walk between it, but then God makes Abram go into a deep sleep, and God walks between the animals. And basically, what that meant in their culture was, we're going to walk between this, and if I should break this agreement, then what happened to these animals happen to me. So what's the significance of the fact that Abram didn't walk between them? Who's this promise all on? This promise is all on God. Abram's going to have nothing, it's going to happen to him. In fact, let's look at chapter 17. Let's look here. Okay, chapter 17, verse 5. God actually changes Abram's name to Abraham, which means father of many nations. I will make you a father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful, and I will make nations and kings from you. It says it clear somewhere else. He says, I will make you fruitful. Verse 20. I will make him fruitful and will multiply him greatly. What does that remind us of? I'll make him fruitful and multiply him. He said that to Adam and Noah, but he said, you do it. To Abram, he says, I will do it for you. I will make you fruitful. I will make you multiply. And this idea of law is now joined with this idea of promise, because it's green at the top and blue at the bottom. And God says, okay, look, I'm going to command this to you, but you can't do it yourself because your wife has no kids, and she's barren, and I will do it for you. We cannot obey God's law unless God enables us to. That would be a huge theme that will be developed later. Where is faith seen throughout this? Everywhere. God says, Abram, do something, and he does it. And we have to wonder, is this promise of restored relationship found in Abram? Is this the end of it? We have to wonder that. Genesis 22, there's a conflict. God grants Abram a child, Isaac. We've waited 10 chapters for this child. And then it starts and it says, after these things, God tested Abraham. And he says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and sacrifice him. And it's said so simply and so easily. And it's like, what? We waited 10 chapters for this kid. And God says, go kill him. And the narrative continues. And Abram got up early. That's Abram. God says something and he does it. Abram got up early, he saddled his donkey, and took with him his son Isaac. And they go, and in verse 5, and Abram said to the young men who came with them, "Stay with the donkeys, the boy and I will go over there to worship and will come back to you." Is he lying? God said, "I'm going to kill you. You're going to kill your son." Abram says, "We're going to come back and worship." Verse 6, Abram took the wood from the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac. We have a story of a son who is carrying the wood for his execution on his back, where he's going to be slain by his father. And then verse 6, it says, "In his hand he took the fire and the sacrifice knife, and the two of them walked together." And it's happening so quickly, and you're like, what is happening? This child we've been waiting for 10 years is about to die. And then in verse 7, it says, Isaac said to his father, "My father," and he replied, "Here I am, my son. Where is the lamb for the offering?" He says, "God will provide it." He trusts in God. Verse 10, it says, "And Abram reached out and took the knife to strike his son." This is happening so quickly. It's like we've waited 10 chapters for this, and then all of a sudden he's going to die in 10 verses. And Abram raises up the knife to kill his son, and the angel of the Lord says, "Abraham, Abraham, do not kill the boy." And he looks over and he sees a ram caught in a thicket, and he offers that to God. How are these promises secured? In Genesis 23, Abram buys a plot of land to bury his wife in. It's the only land that Abram gets before he dies. It's a cave to bury his wife in. In Genesis 24, Isaac gets a wife, because Isaac needs a wife. He's like 40 years old, and Abraham is like, "Well, I guess it's time for you to get married, so I'm going to send my servant to go find a wife for you." So that happens. Genesis 25, God blesses Isaac, and the covenant goes to him. But we find from this, let's look real quick at 22:17. This happens right after the sacrifice thing. "Indeed, I'll bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand of the seashore. Your offspring will possess the gates of his enemies." Verse 60 of chapter 24. Rebekah's friends, they all say, "Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, may your offspring possess the gates of his enemies." This offspring who's coming is going to be a ruler, and he's going to destroy his enemies. But we find from this, the promise here, this promise to Abraham that we saw, is actually just part of this promise of restoration. But we have this hint, your offspring will possess the gates of his enemies. And we're looking forward to this guy who's going to come. To quickly run through the rest of the narrative, Abraham and Sarah have a son, Isaac. He didn't have a wife. That'd be weird. Isaac marries Rebekah, and the promise in Genesis 24, there's both law and promise given, passes from Abraham to Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah have two sons, Jacob and Esau. And God says to them that the younger will serve the older. Isaac wants the promise to go to Esau. He wants him to inherit the birthright. He wants the seed of the woman to come through him, but God says no. And in Genesis 27, it passes over to Jacob. Same language is used for Jacob that was used in Abraham. Verse 27, Isaac blesses Jacob because of some trickery, and he says in 28, "May God give you the dew of the sky and from the richness of the land." Verse 29, "Those who curse you will be cursed, and those who bless you will be blessed." This is clearly the promise of Abraham being passed down. Jacob marries Leah by accident. He goes over to his Laban's house. Laban is the brother of Rebekah, the father of Leah. Jacob comes over and he's like, "I want to marry your daughter Rachel." And Laban's like, "Okay, sounds good. So work for me for 7 years, then you get her." And then Jacob gets married, and then it says the next morning, behold, it was Leah. I don't know how that happened, but it did. And he's like, "What in the world?" So Laban's like, "Okay, fine. In a week you'll get Rachel, but you have to work for me for another 7 years." But it passes like nothing because Jacob loves Rachel so much. Let's move it over so we can kind of see what's going on. Leah has kids. Leah can have children. She has a lot of them. Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, and Judah. Rachel can't have any kids. She's barren. It's the predominant theme that we're going to see. But she says, I have this servant named Bilhah. And so for Bilhah, you know what? You have a kid with Bilhah, and it'll be like you had a kid with me. So Bilhah has Dan and sorry about that, Naphtali. Let's move that. There we go. Okay. So she has Dan and Naphtali. And then Leah's like, well, you know what? If you can do that, I'm going to do that too. So I have Zilpah. So Zilpah is going to come in and have Gad and Asher. And then Leah comes and has another litter, and she has Issachar and Zebulun. Okay? So this is going crazy here. And then Rachel is blessed. God remembers Rachel, and she has Joseph and Benjamin. And so we have to ask the question, with all these sons, who will receive the birthright and blessing? Who is the seed of the woman going to come through? I mean, there's a lot of options. It could be Reuben, because he's the firstborn, right? It could be Joseph, because the narrative focuses on him. Quickly with Joseph, because we're almost out of time. With Joseph, there's this famine, or before that. There's all these brothers. Joseph is his father's favorite. So he says, go check out your brothers and tell me if they're doing all right. So Joseph goes and he's like, oh, okay, how you doing, brothers? His brothers are like, we hate you. So they're like, okay, we're going to kill him. But then Judah's like, no, guys, don't kill him because then we're going to feel bad. Let's just sell him on Craigslist. So they're like, we're going to put him in, they sell him to the Egyptians, right? So he's down in Egypt and he's falsely accused for trying to rape his slave master's wife. He goes to jail, but then he becomes second in command of Egypt because he's able to interpret dreams. He holds on to these dreams of his youth that God has given to him. And we wonder, is it going to be Joseph? Because the narrative spends a lot of time talking about him. Or maybe it's going to be Naphtali, because Naphtali is the firstborn of Rachel through Bilhah. It's like, who's it going to be? And we find in Genesis 49, where the question is answered, who will receive the birthright / blessing? Or the question, what kind of people does God bless? What kind of people does God enter into a relationship with? To make it simple, we'll narrow it down to 3 people. I was going to have us read this, but we're running out of time again. So I'll summarize what happens. These are 3 very similar stories. Joseph, where he talked about, falsely accused of wanting to sleep with Potiphar's wife. She screams and says, he's come here to mock us, and he's come here to sleep with me, and Joseph goes to jail for doing the right thing. He didn't even want to do this. He's falsely accused. He actually runs from her when she says, sleep with me. He goes to jail. Reuben, right after Rachel, his father's favorite wife, dies, Reuben sleeps with Zilpah. Who's Zilpah? Zilpah is Leah's servant. And it's like, what? And it says, and Jacob knew about it. But Jacob doesn't say anything, not until Genesis 49. Judah has 4 sons. This woman, Tamar, marries Judah's first son, and his son dies. So for their legal system, it's like, okay, if your first son doesn't produce a wife, then your brother gets to marry his sister-in-law. Okay, it's really weird. I wouldn't want my brother marrying my wife if I died. That'd be just weird. But this happens again, and then the son dies. Happens again, and the son dies. 3 times, Tamar's husband from a son of Judah dies. And so then Judah's like, look, you're bad luck. You're not getting my 4th son. He's just going to die again. And then Tamar's just like, you owe me a son. So Tamar dresses up like a prostitute. Okay? Lures Jacob in, and Jacob sleeps with her. Jacob doesn't know it's his Judah. Not Jacob. Judah. Thank you, Emily. Judah sleeps with her, doesn't know it's his daughter-in-law. So then we find in Genesis 38, it's like this random passage in the middle of this text, in the middle of this Joseph narrative. They find out that Tamar's pregnant, and Judah's just like, well, bring her to me, and we'll kill her, because she shouldn't be sleeping around. And it's like, Judah, come on, man. What? So he says, okay, how'd this happen? And she's like, oh, well, the guy who slept with me paid me with this staff. And it's like, ooh, that's Judah's staff. And it's like, shoot, Judah's caught. And Judah responds in chapter 38, in verse 26, she is more righteous than I. And he repents. He repents of his sin. So what kind of people does God bless? What kind of people does God enter into a relationship with? That's the question we're asking. Who is it going to be? Judah. Let's look at chapter 49. Chapter 49, verse 8. This is Jacob's last words. He says something to all of his sons. He says to Judah, Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. Judah is a young lion. My son, you will return from the kill. He crouches, he lies down like a lion or a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes. Who's the he? I don't know. And the obedience of the people belongs to him. From Judah, someone will come who will rule. Probably the same person who will possess the gates of his enemies and crush the head of the serpent. This story that seems to be about Joseph is about Joseph, but it's only about Joseph as much as it's about Judah. Joseph protects Judah. There's a famine, and he provides protection for Judah, who the seed of the serpent is going to come through. To finish it up in 2 minutes, the people come down to Egypt. This time it's good. God says, don't worry about it. You can go down to Egypt. No big deal. I understand there's a famine. They live in the land of Goshen. It says their offspring are, there's a list like 70 people come down. That's significant from a guy who couldn't have any kids. Blessing, this is really interesting. The Egyptians hate shepherds, and these people are nomads and shepherds. But we find in Genesis 47, when Jacob comes down, 47, 7 through 10, Joseph brought his father Jacob to present him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. What? There's a nomad, a guy who doesn't have any home. He just has a promise from God, blesses the king of one of the most powerful empires on the earth. These promises are foreshadowed. We need more. You know, there's always that one movie that's really awesome, pretty cool, right? And then all of a sudden they make a sequel, and you're like, that had nothing to do with the first one, and it wasn't good at all. And then they make that cartoon series with it, and you're like, you're just looking for more money. We get to the end of Genesis, and it's not like that. This movie, great movie. I love this movie, Lord of the Rings. How does Lord of the Rings end? The first one, Fellowship of the Ring. Does anyone remember what they say? Any Tolkien fanatics here? Okay, so Sam and Frodo are looking off at Mount Doom, where they're going to destroy the ring. And Frodo says to Sam, do you think we're ever going to see our friends again? And Sam says, we may yet, Mr. Frodo. We may yet. And they walk off towards Mount Doom. And you say, there has to be a sequel. There has to be another one. And we find that comes with the Two Towers, the sequel. How Genesis ends. This is Joseph's last words before he dies. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid, and he will take you up out of this land, the land that he promised an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath, and he said, God will surely come to your aid, and you must carry my bones up from this place, because this is not where I'm going to stay. I have a promise from God. And the book of Genesis ends. And we need the sequel. So come next week.